softening with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm yet warm. "You acted bravely and without hesitation. That kind of courage is rare." Ethan shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious under the weight of everyone's eyes. "I just did what anyone would do," he muttered, looking down at his worn sneakers. Jack extended a hand. "No, not everyone would." "What's your name, son?" "Ethan Daniels," he replied quietly, shaking Jack's hand. Jack paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Daniels? Are you Helen's boy?" Ethan nodded. Jack exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca, whose expression had shifted to one of recognition. "You have a good mother," Jack said. "She's talked about you before. You've got her strength." Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. He wasn't used to hearing kind words from authority figures, let alone the police. Rebecca slowly stood, steadying herself with Jack's help. "Ethan," she said softly, "you might have saved more than just me today. You protected my baby, too." Her voice cracked slightly, and her hand rested over her stomach. The crowd, which had grown quiet, began murmuring again, but this time the tone was different. Some people nodded in approval, while others clapped lightly. Ethan looked around, unsure of what to say. "I just wanted to help," he stammered. Jack smiled and patted his shoulder. "Well, you did, and I won't forget it." As the commotion settled and Rebecca was helped to a nearby patrol car to rest, Jack stayed back for a moment. He crouched slightly to meet Ethan's gaze. "I know about your father's case," he said, his tone serious but kind. "I've been meaning to revisit it. Maybe it's time I did." Ethan's eyes widened. "You mean you'll look into it?" Jack nodded. "Sometimes justice just needs a little nudge, and today you gave me one." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in years, hope flickered within him. Jack stood, giving Ethan one last firm pat on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Ethan, and keep that courage. It'll take you far." As the crowd dispersed and life returned to the bustling street, Ethan walked home with a lighter step. His father's watch felt heavier in his pocket, but not as a burden. Instead, it seemed to hum with the promise of change and the possibility that justice, no matter how delayed, might finally find its way. It wasn't his father. Daniel had always taught Ethan to value honesty and integrity. He would never do something like that. "My dad wasn't even there that night," Ethan explained, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "He was home with me, helping me with my homework, but no one believed us." Jack listened intently, his brow furrowing as he processed the details. Rebecca stood beside him, her hand still on Ethan's shoulder, offering silent support. Ethan continued, his words spilling out in a rush. "The footage is blurry, and the guy testifying against my dad? He got a promotion after my dad was fired. It doesn't make sense. My mom's been working non-stop trying to keep us afloat, but it's been so hard without my dad." Jack nodded slowly, his mind already piecing together the complexity of the situation. He glanced at Rebecca, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "I can't make any promises, Ethan," Jack said carefully, "but I'll start by pulling up the case files and talking to the people involved. If there's anything suspicious, I'll find it." Ethan's eyes widened, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Jack stood, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did something remarkable today, Ethan. And sometimes, courage like yours can change more than you realize." Rebecca smiled warmly. "You're a brave young man, Ethan. Your dad would be proud of you." Ethan felt a swell of emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For the first time It felt like someone in a position of power truly cared about what had happened to his father. As Jack turned to make a call on his radio, likely to start the process of revisiting the case, Rebecca crouched down to meet Ethan's gaze. "No matter what happens, don't lose that belief in justice," she said softly. "It's what keeps the world moving forward." Ethan nodded, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. The day had started like any other, but now it felt like a door had opened. A door that might lead to the justice his family had been waiting for. Tampering? The detail gnawed at him, and he made a note to have the footage analyzed by a forensic video specialist. Next, Jack turned to the witness testimony. The key witness, a fellow warehouse employee named Greg Harper, had been the one to identify Daniel as the perpetrator. Harper's statement had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but something about it felt too convenient, especially after Ethan's comment about Harper receiving a promotion shortly after Daniel's conviction. Jack decided to dig deeper. He pulled Harper's employment records and noticed that the promotion had indeed come suspiciously fast, just weeks after Daniel was arrested. More troubling was the significant pay raise that accompanied it. Jack leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. A pattern was emerging, but it wasn't yet clear. If Harper had lied, why? And who else might have been involved? The next morning, Jack met with the forensic specialist assigned to analyze the video footage. After several hours of meticulous work, the specialist confirmed Jack's suspicions. The blurring in the footage wasn't a technical glitch, the specialist explained. It was altered. Someone deliberately tampered with this section of the video to obscure details. Jack's jaw tightened. This was no longer just a question of an old case. It was evidence of foul play. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jack arranged to interview Greg Harper. The meeting took place in a small, sterile room at the precinct. Harper arrived looking uneasy, his eyes darting nervously as he sat across from Jack. "Mr. Harper," Jack began, his tone measured but firm, "I have some follow-up questions about your testimony in the Daniel Carter case." Harper shifted in his seat. "I already gave my statement a year ago. What's there to talk about now?" Jack leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "New information has come to light. I need you to clarify some inconsistencies." Harper swallowed hard, his discomfort evident. "Like what?" "Like the promotion you received shortly after Carter's conviction," Jack said, watching Harper's reaction closely. "And the altered surveillance footage that you claimed corroborated your testimony." Harper's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Jack didn't let up. "Here's the thing, Mr. Harper. If you're covering for someone, or if you were coerced into giving false testimony, now is the time to come clean. Otherwise, you'll go down with them." Harper broke. His shoulders slumped, and he exhaled shakily. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "That was the supervisor," Harper admitted. "He told me to pin it on Carter, said Carter was already on thin ice and that no one would believe him anyway. They promised me a promotion if I played along." Jack felt a surge of anger but kept his voice steady. "Who's they?" Harper hesitated, then said, "The regional manager and the supervisor. They were skimming from shipments, and they needed a scapegoat when things got messy." Jack sat back, his suspicions confirmed. The case against Daniel Carter had been built on lies and manipulation. Harper's confession was the first step toward unraveling the truth. With this new evidence, Jack knew he had a long road ahead. But for the first time, he felt confident that justice could be served, not just for Daniel Carter, but for Ethan and his family. Paul hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the hallway before stepping back to let Jack in. The apartment was dimly lit and cluttered, a reflection of Paul's own disheveled state. Jack stood firm, his presence filling the small room. "I can't help you," Paul muttered, pacing near the window. "It's done. Over." "It's not over," Jack said, his tone unwavering. "Not until I understand why you testified against Daniel Carter. The evidence doesn't add up, and you know it." Paul stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He let out a bitter laugh. You don't know what you're asking, Detective. If I talk, I'm done for." "You're already in this, Paul," Jack replied. The surveillance footage was doctored. The access card was used by someone else, and now an anonymous threat. This isn't just about Daniel Carter anymore. This is about corruption. If you know something, you need to come clean. Paul sank into a worn chair, his head in his hands. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I didn't want to testify against Carter. I was forced. They said if I didn't, I'd lose my job, or worse." "Who forced you?" Jack pressed. Paul glanced at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in. It was the higher-ups, the regional manager and the warehouse supervisor. They were running their own side operation, skimming goods and selling them off. When something went wrong and they needed a fall guy, they picked Carter. Jack's jaw tightened. "And you went along with it." "I didn't have a choice," Paul snapped, his voice rising in desperation. "They showed me a fake video, told me what to say, and promised they'd take care of me, but once Carter was convicted, they cut ties. I've been living in fear ever since." Jack's mind raced as he processed Paul's confession. The pieces were coming together. A larger conspiracy involving powerful individuals manipulating evidence to cover their tracks. "You need to testify," Jack said firmly. Paul shook his head vehemently. "No way. If they find out I talked, I'm dead." "I'll protect you," Jack assured him. "But you need to trust me. This is the only way to make things right." Paul stared at Jack, doubt and fear warring in his expression. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll do it. But you better keep your word, Detective." Jack left the apartment with a renewed sense of determination. With Paul's testimony, the tampered footage, and the access card evidence, he now had a path forward. But he also knew the stakes had risen. Whoever was behind this conspiracy wouldn't go down without a fight. As he walked back to his car, Jack glanced over his shoulder, his instincts on high alert. The shadows seemed darker, the quiet more menacing. He'd taken a step closer to the truth, but he was also stepping into dangerous territory. For Daniel Carter, for Ethan, and for justice, Jack knew he couldn't turn back now. Paul hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping. "Fine, but you didn't hear this from me," he muttered, stepping aside to let Jack in. Paul sat on a sagging couch, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I never saw Daniel in the warehouse," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was working late, yeah, but I wasn't near the theft. They told me what to say, said if I didn't, I'd regret it." Jack leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Who's they, Paul? Who made you lie?" Paul shook his head violently, panic flashing in his eyes. "I can't tell you. You don't know what they're capable of. If I talk, I'm as good as dead." Jack exhaled slowly, reining in his frustration. Paul's fear was palpable, and pushing him further now would only make him shut down. "You've done the right thing by telling me this," Jack said, standing. "But if you want to stop living in fear, you'll have to give me more when you're ready." Back at the station, Jack confronted Mason in his office. "Well, Stanford admitted he was coerced into giving false testimony," Jack said, his voice hard. "How do you explain that?" Mason leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Sometimes, Jack, you do what's necessary to close a case. The system isn't perfect, but it works." Jack slammed his fist on the desk, his voice rising. "Works for who, Mason? For you? For the people pulling the strings? An innocent man is in prison because of this." Mason's expression darkened, and he stood, meeting Jack's glare. "Careful, Jack, you start digging too deep, you might find yourself buried. Not everyone wants the truth uncovered." The tension in the room was suffocating as Jack stepped back, his jaw tight. Mason's words confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't just a case of negligence or coincidence. There was deliberate corruption at play, and Mason was part of it. The next day, Jack discovered that the access card data had been erased from the system. The technician claimed it was an accident, but Jack wasn't buying it. Someone on the inside was actively sabotaging the investigation. Calling an emergency meeting, Jack faced a wall of blank stares and vague responses. The silence was deafening, and the betrayal stung. That evening, Jack sat alone in his dimly lit office, the weight of the case pressing down on him. Ethan's hopeful eyes and Daniel's unjust imprisonment haunted him. Holding the watch Ethan had given him, Jack made a silent vow. "No matter the cost, I will expose the truth." Stepping outside, the cold night air stung his face. Jack pulled out his phone and called Rebecca. "Meet me at home," he said. "I need to go over something with you." At home, Jack laid out everything: the fabricated evidence, Paul's coerced testimony, Mason's complicity, and the erased card data. Rebecca listened intently, her face a mix of concern and determination. "Jack, if you keep pushing, they'll come after you." "This isn't just about one case anymore," Rebecca said quietly. "I know," Jack replied, his voice steady. "But Ethan didn't hesitate to save you, even when it put him at risk. I can't let him down. I owe him, and Daniel, the truth." Rebecca placed her hand on Jack's shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "Then we'll face this together. For Ethan, for Daniel, and for every person who's been silenced by injustice." Jack clasped her hand, drawing strength from her support. Together they prepared to take the next step, knowing the fight ahead would be dangerous but necessary. Jack stood silently, staring out of the window of his office as the morning sun cast long shadows across the room. Rebecca entered, her soft footsteps pulling Jack from his thoughts. She approached him, her expression a mix of relief and quiet pride. "It's over," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "For now. But this isn't the end. Mason might be behind bars, but the system that let him get away with this for so long is still broken." Rebecca tilted her head, searching his face. "You did what no one else was willing to do, Jack. You gave Ethan his father back. You proved the truth still matters." Jack turned to face her, his expression softening. Ethan was the real hero here. He faced down fear and gave Paul the courage to speak. Without him, he shook his head, none of this would have been possible. At that moment there was a knock on the door. Ethan peeked in, his small face lighting up when he saw Jack. "Uncle Jack!" Jack smiled, motioning him inside. Ethan rushed in, his steps quick with excitement. In his hands was a framed photo of his father, freshly released, and smiling. "My dad said to tell you thank you for everything." Jack knelt down to Ethan's level, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Your dad's a good man, Ethan, and so are you. Never forget that." Ethan grinned, his eyes shining with happiness. "Are you going to keep helping people like my dad?" Jack exchanged a glance with Rebecca, then looked back at Ethan. "That's the plan. But I'll need brave people like you to keep me on the right track." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I'll help whenever you need me." Rebecca smiled, her hand slipping into Jack's as Ethan darted out of the room, full of energy. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting. The fight for justice had cost him, but it had also given him renewed purpose. Together with Rebecca, and with Ethan's unwavering belief in what was right, he was ready to face whatever came next. Jack visited the Carter family a few days later in their modest apartment. Daniel was busy repairing old furniture, his hands moving with a quiet determination, as if trying to rebuild not just their home, but the life that had been shattered. When Daniel saw Jack at the door, he set down his tools and smiled warmly. "Jack," he said, his voice carrying a gratitude that words could barely express. "Come in. You're family now." Jack stepped inside, the room filled with a newfound warmth. Helen was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a meal, and Ethan was perched on a stool, working on a small wooden model his father had started teaching him to build. "How are things settling in?" Jack asked, glancing around at the signs of renewal. Daniel chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "It feels strange, being free again, but every day I wake up and thank God for my family. And for you." Jack shook his head. "You should thank Ethan. That boy's courage is what brought the truth to light." Ethan looked up, his face beaming with pride. "Uncle Jack, I just wanted to help. You're the one who made it happen." Jack smiled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "We all did our part, and now it's about moving forward." Helen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Stay for dinner, Jack," she said with a warmth that made it less of an invitation and more of a command. Jack hesitated but then nodded. "I'd like that." As they sat around the small, crowded table that evening, laughter and stories filled the room. The shadow that had loomed over the Carter family for so long was finally lifting. Later, as Jack prepared to leave, Daniel walked him to the door. "I don't know what the future holds," Daniel said, his voice steady, "but I do know that because of you, my family has a chance to face it together." Jack placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've got your life back, Daniel. Use it well." Walking away into the night, Jack felt a rare sense of peace. The road ahead would still be fraught with challenges. Corruption wasn't something that disappeared overnight, but this victory reminded him why he had chosen this path. For the truth. For justice. For families like the Carters, who deserved a fighting chance. Lawyer who had dedicated her career to fighting for justice in underserved communities. Laura listened intently as Ethan shared his family's story, her eyes reflecting admiration for his courage and determination. "You've been through so much at such a young age," Laura said. "Your resilience is remarkable, Ethan. If you're serious about becoming a lawyer, I'd be honored to mentor you." Ethan's face lit up. "Really? That would mean so much to me." Laura nodded. "With your drive and passion for justice, I have no doubt you'll make a difference." Over the next few months, Ethan began volunteering at the legal aid office, helping with small tasks and observing how lawyers like Laura worked tirelessly to defend those in need. Each day, he grew more inspired to pursue his dream. Meanwhile, the Carter family continued to rebuild their lives. Daniel's work at the police station allowed him to contribute to the community in a meaningful way. He often repaired equipment and quietly supported officers who valued integrity, earning their respect. Helen thrived in her new job, her confidence growing as she provided for her family in a stable and less stressful environment. Jack and Rebecca remained close to the Carters, visiting often and offering support whenever needed. Jack in particular took pride in seeing Ethan flourish and Daniel regain his sense of purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stood on the rooftop of the police station, gazing at the city below. Rebecca joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You did good, Jack," she said softly. "Not just for the Carters, but for yourself. You reminded everyone that truth and justice still matter." Jack sipped his coffee, a small smile playing on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Rebecca. Or without Ethan. That boy reminded me why I started this work in the first place." Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder. "The fight isn't over, Jack, but you've proven that even in the darkest times, light can find a way." Jack nodded, his resolve renewed. The road ahead would always have challenges, but for now, the Carter family's laughter and hope were proof that change was possible, and that was enough to keep him going. "Concept or something reserved for the rich and powerful, it's something we all deserve," Ethan said, his voice steady but passionate. "If we stand together and fight for what's right, we can change things. We can help each other." The student sat quietly, listening to him with rapt attention. Ethan continued, "I'm not special. I'm just someone who wanted to make a difference, and if I can, so can you." Afterward, several students came up to him, expressing their gratitude and saying they wanted to make a difference too. Ethan smiled, knowing that his story was inspiring others, just as it had inspired him. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected call from Mrs. Laura. "Ethan, I have a surprise for you," she said. "I spoke to a few colleagues, and we've arranged for you to shadow a lawyer at a law firm. It's a big step, but I know you're ready." Ethan could hardly believe it, shadowing a lawyer at a firm. This was the opportunity he had dreamed of. He immediately called his parents to share the news, his voice full of excitement. Daniel and Helen were overjoyed for him, their pride in their son evident. "You're going to do great, Ethan," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've already done so much, and this is just the beginning." Ethan's first day at the firm was both thrilling and intimidating. He sat in on meetings, observed court proceedings, and took notes as the lawyers discussed various cases. He was amazed at how much there was to learn, but he felt determined to absorb every bit of knowledge. At the end of the day, the senior lawyer he had shadowed, Mr. Carter, pulled him aside. "You have a good head on your shoulders, Ethan," Mr. Carter said, shaking his hand. "Keep working hard, and you'll go far in this field." Ethan walked out of the building that evening with a sense of fulfillment. As he looked up at the skyline, he felt more certain than ever that he was on the right path. Back at home, the Carter family had settled into their new routine. Ethan continued his studies and volunteer work, while Daniel and Helen embraced their new roles. Jack and Rebecca visited often, offering their support and encouragement. Ethan had come a long way from the boy who once thought his future was uncertain. Now, he was making waves in the community, both through his work at the legal aid organization and by inspiring others to believe in themselves. As he sat down at the dinner table with his family, Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Ethan, not just for what you've done, but for who you've become." Ethan smiled, looking at his parents and feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. "You gave me the strength to keep going, even when things seemed impossible." The family shared a quiet moment, knowing that their journey was far from over. But together, they had found something that no one could take away: hope. Straightened up, a new fire burning in his chest. "You're right, Jack," Ethan said, determination filling his voice. "I can't back down now. I'm not just fighting for one person, I'm fighting for all of them." With Jack's encouragement, Ethan began preparing for the battle ahead. He worked tirelessly, researching the case, gathering evidence, and interviewing witnesses. Though the corporation's legal team was powerful, Ethan remained resolute, refusing to let fear or doubt dictate his actions. Weeks passed, and the case became a symbol of hope for the community. News of Ethan's fight spread throughout the neighborhood, drawing the attention of those who had long felt powerless. They saw in him a symbol of justice, a beacon in the darkness. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with anticipation. Ethan stood before the judge, ready to face the corporation's legal team. His heart raced, but his resolve was unshakable. He knew this battle was bigger than just a case. It was about restoring trust in a broken system and proving that one person could make a difference. As the trial progressed, Ethan's arguments were compelling and well-crafted. He uncovered flaws in the corporation's evidence, challenged their witnesses, and exposed the underhanded tactics they had used to manipulate the case. With each piece of evidence he presented, Ethan's confidence grew. He wasn't just defending Mrs. Marjorie, he was defending the very principles of fairness and integrity. Finally, after days of intense deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. The corporation's actions had been unjust, and Mrs. Marjorie's family was to be compensated and allowed to regain their home. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a deep sense of triumph. As the case came to a close, Ethan stood beside Mrs. Marjorie, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think anyone would ever fight for us." Ethan smiled, looking at her with kindness. "You didn't give up, and neither will I," he replied. "Justice was always on your side. You just needed someone to help you find it." After the case, word of Ethan's victory spread like wildfire. People began seeking him out from all corners of the city, hoping for his help with their own struggles. His small office, once a quiet space, was now a bustling hub of activity, filled with individuals seeking justice, much like he once had. Though his work was demanding, Ethan never forgot his roots. He often returned to the old neighborhood, visiting the community that had supported him throughout his journey. He would spend time with the people, listening to their stories and offering whatever help he could. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood, Ethan looked at the streets he once roamed with his head down. Now, he walked with his head held high, knowing that his fight for justice had made a real difference. He had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of so many others. As he passed a group of children playing in the street, one of them called out to him, "Hey, aren't you the lawyer who helped that old lady? You're awesome!" Ethan smiled and waved, feeling a sense of pride. The world may have been tough, but with enough courage, determination, and the belief in justice, it was possible to change it, one case at a time. Sanctuary for so many years, the place where his journey had truly begun. He could see the determination and dedication in the faces of the young lawyers he had mentored. It was clear they shared his vision, and he realized they would continue the work, even if he wasn't physically present. With a deep breath, Ethan made his decision. "All right," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll take the opportunity, but this office will remain here. You all will continue the work we've started, and will grow this even further. Together we will make sure that no one is ever left behind." The room filled with applause and cheers, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. As he prepared for his new chapter with the GL Justice Initiative, he knew that his mission to bring justice to those who needed it most would expand far beyond the walls of his office. His heart remained firmly planted in the community that had shaped him, and he was confident that his legacy would endure wherever his path might lead. As Ethan packed his things, he glanced at the old watch in its case, a symbol of the past that had guided him through so many trials. It was now a symbol not only of his father's strength, but of the values Ethan had carried with him into every battle. It would always remind him that courage, integrity, and justice were universal principles, ones that could be spread across the globe. Ethan took one last walk through the old neighborhood before leaving for his new venture. The streets were filled with people, some who had been his clients, others who had been part of his community from the beginning. He stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing that he was about to embark on a journey that would take him far from home, but the lessons of his past would always guide him. His story had started here, in this neighborhood, with his family, but it was far from over. It was just the beginning of something much larger. Ethan was no longer just a young boy fighting for justice. He had become a beacon of hope for others, and his journey had only just begun. "I've heard so much about you," the boy said, his voice filled with admiration. "I want to be just like you. You inspired me to fight for justice." Ethan studied Noah, seeing in him a reflection of his younger self. The same fire, the same determination. Ethan smiled and walked over to him, extending his hand. "It's good to meet you, Noah. What's your story?" Noah hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice steadying. "I grew up seeing my community struggle, just like you did. I've seen injustice, and I know what it feels like to be powerless. But your story gave me hope. I want to make a difference, just like you did." Ethan's heart swelled with pride. "You've already made the first step by deciding to stand up. Now it's all about staying true to your purpose and never giving up. The road ahead will be hard, but you can make it." Noah looked up at Ethan with a newfound confidence. "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes." As the days passed, Ethan continued his work with the Global Justice Initiative, traveling to more places where injustice prevailed. But each time he returned to his neighborhood, he found his roots growing deeper, his connections to the people stronger. He had become more than just a lawyer. He had become a mentor, a beacon of hope for those who felt they had no voice. The mural in his old neighborhood stood as a testament to his journey, a symbol of his mission to ensure that justice was not just an abstract concept, but a reality for everyone, no matter their background or circumstances. Ethan had never imagined his path would take him so far, but every step along the way had been worth it. As the years passed, Ethan continued to fight for justice across the globe, but he never lost sight of the people who had helped him become the man he was. Each victory, each case, was a tribute to his family, his community, and everyone who had believed in him. Ethan Carter's legacy lived on, not just in the legal victories he had won, but in the countless lives he had touched. Through his unwavering belief in justice, he had inspired a generation to believe that no one was too small to make a difference, and that with courage, compassion, and determination, anything was possible. "Dangerous, they're scared, and understandably so," he added, concern evident in his voice. Ethan nodded, his gaze firm. "You're right, Noah, but without their voices, this injustice will continue. We'll take every precaution to protect them. Let's earn their trust and show them they're not alone." In the weeks that followed, Ethan and his team worked tirelessly, meeting workers in secret, documenting their experiences, and gathering evidence. The factory's leadership responded with threats and attempts to discredit Ethan's team, but they remained resolute, knowing the stakes were too high to back down. The case culminated in a high-profile trial that drew national attention. Ethan's team presented undeniable evidence, and the testimonies of brave workers who decided to step forward moved the court and the public. After weeks of intense arguments, the verdict was delivered. The factory was found guilty of labor law violations, corruption, and intimidation. Compensation was ordered for the workers, and sweeping reforms were mandated to ensure better conditions. As the courtroom erupted in relief and celebration, one of the workers approached Ethan with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You've given us more than justice. You've given us hope." Ethan smiled, humbled. "No, it's you who showed courage. Justice exists because of people like you who refuse to stay silent." In the aftermath of the case, Ethan's law office became an even stronger beacon for those seeking justice. Noah continued to grow under Ethan's mentorship, taking on more significant responsibilities and proving himself to be a formidable advocate for the voiceless. The bond between them deepened, built on shared values and the relentless pursuit of fairness. Years later, as Ethan sat in his office reflecting on his journey, Noah knocked on the door. "Mr. Carter," he said with a smile, "there's a young woman here. She says she's inspired by what we do and wants to join our team." Ethan chuckled, recognizing the same spark he'd once seen in Noah. "Bring her in. Let's see if she's ready to take her first step toward justice." As the young woman entered, wide-eyed and eager, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The torch he had carried for so long was now being passed for a new generation, ensuring the fight for justice would continue. His journey had come full circle, and though challenges remained, Ethan knew that the world was a little brighter for the seeds he had sown.